Thank you very much. Oh, that's very loud. Is that clear enough for everyone? Yeah, okay, cool. So yeah, as Kirsty said, I'm going to be talking to you about food production shocks. And what I mean by that is these sudden and unexpected losses in food production that occur at different time scales and different spatial scales. As we can see here, sort of in the early 1990s, this is actually in Germany. It's a time series of livestock production in Germany. And food production shocks can have a number of reasons for occurring. So things like extreme weather, droughts, floods, hurricanes, things like that. And of course, those things can change the biophysical nature of the production system. War and conflict can affect the access to the production system for producers and the safety of production itself. We know production diseases, whether it's fish or livestock or crops, can affect the yields of different food groups. Shocks can also be apparent when an ecosystem has undergone a nonlinear sort of threshold change. So this reached a tipping point. We know that often when we overfish species, then the fundamental underlying structure of the ecosystem undergoes a change, and this is reflecting in a massive drop in landings of the species that we catch. They can also occur just because of changes in funding. So, for example, when the Soviet Union collapsed, then huge amounts of the subsidies that supported food production went with it. And of course, the consequences of these different food shocks are very context dependent, right? They depend on the area and to who they are occurring. So a lot of you will be familiar with this kind of framework of vulnerability. It's not just how exposed a country or a place or a region or people are to a food production shock or how frequently they occur, but also how sensitive they are. So obviously, if a country or region are highly dependent on agriculture for GDP, then of course they're going to be very sensitive to an agricultural shock. And with adaptive capacity, it's also about how well that region or people can cope with the change by either importing more food, trading food, switching to different food alternatives as well. A good example of that is if we look at the difference between the droughts in, say, the sub-Saharan Africa versus Australia. So in the Horn of Africa in 2011, famine occurred across 4 countries. A load of people displaced, thousands of people displaced and requiring food aid, and many, many people dying, so up to 250,000 in Somalia alone dying as a result of this drought. We contrast that with the very severe drought in Australia in the Millennium Drought, which different periods of severity of lack of precipitation created a big problem in Australia in terms of we had a lot of big drops in crop production, livestock losses, and of course those in the agricultural sector were very heavily affected as well. But in terms of the food supply, the average change for the average consumer in Australia, the effects weren't so large. But effects don't have to be direct, they can be indirect through shocks as well. So if you were to take some major producing nations on the left-hand side, that say if you'd look at cereals, that could be Russia, that could be United States, or China or India, then often they supply a lot of the food to the more trade-dependent nations, those nations that can't produce enough food to meet their supply. So in these countries, the orange arrows here are the exports, the direction of exports from the major producing nations towards the trade-dependent nations. Now, of course, if a biophysical or a geopolitical or an economic shock comes along, what it can do is squeeze the production of the major producing nation. And of course, in these times, a lot of those producing nations shut down their exports in order to protect domestic supply. And by doing that, they might maintain some of the shocks, some of the links, to the highest paying nations that are still able to pay those high prices when commodities are scantily available. But they may shut down their exports as well. And for those much more trade-dependent nations, then of course we get this decrease in availability of food, big price increases, hoarding, the tension and conflict that goes with that, and ultimately food insecurity. Of course, this is very context-dependent because if that shock occurs to the country with lots of trade links, the consequences are very different when it occurs to something that is less trade linked and there are fewer countries dependent on it for their food supply. So the motivation behind this work was for a number of reasons. Firstly, at a global level, we have to meet these sort of global hunger targets by 2030, which seems like a very steep ask, but certainly with, ambition is something that we need to have right now. But there is this increased recognition that both terrestrial and aquatic food systems are incredibly important for livelihoods around the world, particularly coastal nations. But there remains a significant disconnect between, between land-sea sustainability research, particularly when it comes to things like shocks. There's a lot of work on agricultural shocks. There's a lot of work on seafood shocks, but they often are using very different methods, and so they're revealing very different trends, and we don't know to what extent there's this sort of standardized assessment across the different sectors, and to what extent different types of shocks affect different sectors. So the aim of this work was pretty much to just use a standardized approach that gives us a representative view of where and why shocks happen in the different food systems. And we're sort of concentrating much more on an exposure point of view. And the idea was to try and understand to what extent and why people are exposed to these different food security shocks and how that affects their vulnerability in terms of their food security and livelihood. And at a global significance, of course, accounting for these different drivers of shocks will be central to forming sustainable food policy into the future. If we don't know what is driving these different things, then, of course, forming food policy that's going to still be affected by these unpredictable changes in food production is going to be a tough thing to crack. So we took a global approach to the analysis, and we looked across 741 different time series from a number of different sectors, so crops, livestock, capture fisheries, and aquaculture. And we aggregated production up to total production for commodities. So we didn't say, like, look at wheat. We just looked at total crop production. And we did that for from 1961 to 2013. So we looked at these historical trends and also looked across 8 different regions around the world to analyze the trends in shocks themselves. We used a quantitative detection method, that is, for each time series. We aggregated data to total production for each sector, so total crop production, total livestock production. We used local regression models with a span of 0.6, I'll get to that in a second, and we fitted that to the data. From that data, we then took, which is the second graph down there, we then took the residuals from this model fit up here and regressed against the lag 1 residual, so the residuals from the time step before. The idea being that we're looking for these from a small residual to a big residual. We're looking for those big changes, so the breaks in the order correlation structure of the time series. And from that regression, we're looking at which one of these data points has a large sort of influence and leverage on how this linear model sits within the data. And we did that using Cook's distance. So above a certain threshold, we found that that's the threshold we identified as something that is large. I'll get to that in a second as well. But if a data point within this regression had a Cook's distance of greater than 0.3, we identified it as a shock. And that corresponds to this drop from this data point here to this data point here. And again, that's the collapse of communism in East Germany in the late 80s. But we also only included a shock in the data if at that shock point, which is that little data point there, if that is lower than the previous 7-year production median. And looking at the different trends in shock exposure, what we did is we said, well, there are regional shock frequencies and there are temporal shock frequencies, so we looked at both. So regional shock frequencies, the total number of shocks for a region over the whole time period divided by the number of time series that we use to detect those shocks. And then we looked at temporal trends in shock frequency across time, and that is the total number of shocks globally per year divided by the number of countries that are actually producing food in that sector in that year. The shock size, so that is the loss in production in tons relative to the previous 7-year median, so that previous baseline. And shock recovery time, so that is the number of years taken to recover from the shock point back up to within 5% of the previous baseline. Now, you may be asking, why am I using specific things like Cook's distance 0.3, span of 0.6, 7-year median baseline? It's all a bit specific. And it's basically because we did a sort of sensitivity analysis of these parameters through time. We wanted to know that, of course, particularly if we're looking at trends of shocks through time, we want to know that that trend is a real trend and not just a function of the parameters that we're using. So What we did is we ran this analysis a number of times, changing little incremental changes to each one of these parameters each time. And that allowed us to sort of form, in terms of number of shocks, a sort of a confidence interval of shocks. And taking the median, which is the black dotted line of that, we then used the combination of parameters which were closest. So it sort of minimized the sum of squares between that median dotted black line, and the combination of parameters that did that was a 7-year median production baseline and a span of 0.6 of the lowest model, and a 0.3 of the Cook's distance. The Cook's distance we actually did separately because obviously all these parameters affect whether you can detect a shock or not. And if you use a really low value for Cook's distance, which is one sort of rule of thumb, it's down here, everything essentially becomes a shock. And if you use another rule of thumb, very few things are a shock. So what we wanted to do is try and find at what point there's a sort of optimum point where it all before everything turns silly, but you still want to keep it within the sort of major detection, sort of the optimum detection range. We combined that quantitative approach with a qualitative search for the drivers of the shock. Now, we did that because shocks are often very complex in why they occurred. A flood may occur, but the reason that a flood did so much damage could also be because of a huge amount of deforestation that happened at the time. And so taking these combined qualitative and quantitative approaches, it was quite powerful to understanding whether what we're seeing had causation rather than just correlation. And so when we looked at shocks across time, the shock frequencies, we can see they varied significantly across regions. We saw 226 globally. In South Asia, you can see here for both crops and livestock, South Asia was the most affected in terms of agriculture. Aquaculture, and it was largely to do with flooding. Aquaculture was most frequently affected anyway, around Latin America and the Caribbean, whereas capture fisheries were much more homogeneous in terms of how frequently shocks occurred throughout space. But, sorry, that last trend, the fisheries one, kind of makes sense when we sort of start to look at the drivers. When we look at drivers, of all the shocks, over 50% of the crops to shock production since 1961 to 2013 were driven, at least to some extent, by climate or weather events. Majority being drought. Livestock, they were most influenced by geopolitical events, largely conflict, sub-Saharan Africa, but also the fall of communism in Europe in the early 1990s. But what I was talking about before with the map is if we look at this little block here, which is about 40% of all fishery shocks were due to overfishing. And that kind of makes sense when we start looking at why fishery shocks were much more evenly distributed. There is overfishing pretty much everywhere on the globe. And so we know that that's at least part of the trend that we're seeing there. So there's a whole number of reasons why aquaculture shocks occurred. A lot of them were economic, so market competitiveness was often a problem for a lot of small producing nations. But the biggest single driver was in this little category here, which is other, but it's made up, in aquaculture's case, of disease, quite a lot of disease. We also looked at shock size of recovery times, as I said. Now, I'll just let you absorb this picture just for a little second. Firstly, what you need to be looking at here is these are drivers, the colored blocks on one side of these circles. Each circle, of course, is a sector. And each of these gray zones here is a region. And what we're saying is the size of the shock flowing from one driver to a region. And so the width of the chord here is the shock size. And the biggest shocks here are outlined by a dotted line. And the opacity of the chord is to do with the recovery time. So it's a very thick, it's a dark shade of red, for example, there. That means there was a long recovery time there compared to a lighter one. But essentially, there's just a few things that we wanted to point out with this figure, and that was that despite we have these global trends of why shocks are occurring, it varies significantly across regions. So if you look at sub-Saharan Africa down here, most of the shocks, and in fact the biggest shock, certainly in Nigeria, is around here. A lot of them were caused by conflict. Whereas if you look at South Asia, that area that was sort of lit up in very dark red on the map, that was largely driven by climate and weather events coming through to South Asia here. The largest shocks are often geopolitical, which again makes sense. A lot of food production is supported by subsidies, and so when they're withdrawn, you get these huge drops in production. So, for example, here, this is the collapse of the Soviet Union, and this is what happens when you withdraw the Soviet distant water fishing fleets. Here, this was sort of an indirect effect of shocks, and through the collapse of the Soviet Union again, they withdrew a lot of their funding and subsidies from North Korean aquaculture. But the largest shocks don't always create the longest recovery times. We saw that recovery times are a bit of a strange one for reasons I won't really go into too much here. But these step changes, they're not always the longest, but geopolitical shocks, again, it makes sense. They tend to lend to inadequate conditions for recovery. We also see from our study that pretty much in every sector we're seeing an increase in shock frequency through time. So essentially the way to read this plot is each one of these sort of line graphs below has the corresponding trend in drivers to it. And so the red line is the analysis that we used, and the gray zone is that confidence interval around it. Underneath here, these bar graphs basically correspond to the above line, the red line there. Yeah. So, and these are all the different drivers, and the dotted line here is the diversity of drivers over time. So, what we found is that particularly in crops, we see a big clump of red up here. So the climate and weather events became more frequent within our analysis within crops. And that you can see that kind of corresponds as well to a drop in diversity. It's mostly climate related in that top sector there. Whereas in all other sectors, generally the frequency of shocks increased over time, frequency and the diversity of shocks increased over time. So one thing I didn't point out here is it's kind of hard to see whether there is an increase in shock frequency because it varies so much. So if you see the dotted black line, that's the decadal increase in our analysis of the red line. And that's the same in each plot. And that dark zone there is the decadal minima and maxima of that confidence interval. So even if you look at the confidence interval, or if you looked at our analysis, shock rates are increasing over time, even at the minima and maxima. And so we can only really speculate. We only have enough room really to speculate about why this diversity of shocks is increasing in other sectors other than crops. And it's hard to say. It could be globalization, for example. It could be the telecoupling of systems over large scales. For example, aquaculture is much more now combined with both agricultural systems and fishery systems at the same time. So it's still dependent on a number of different interdependencies within systems, which means that whatever they're affected by will also have an influence on aquaculture. The one thing that we did see as well, interestingly, is that shocks aren't limited to one sector, and this is going to cause some interesting problems for sustainability targets into the future, because we tend to look after our oceans. We have these targets for biodiversity, we have these targets for food production, and shocks can often reach across multiple sectors. So, for example, in Afghanistan, while there was a big drought in the early 2000s, there was a big drop in crop production, big drop in livestock production. We expect this, but there was also a shock to fisheries, and that's because, of course, in Afghanistan, fisheries are 100% inland fisheries based. And so, of course, that's highly dependent on precipitation, rainfall, and so that can, of course, disrupt people's adaptive capacity to switch to different food produce during times of shocks. The other one is how these shocks can be transmitted by people themselves. So, for example, in Dominica, in 1979, there was a big hurricane, Hurricane David, which wiped out the banana plantations in Dominica, absolutely devastated them. But there was also, just immediately after the hurricane, a massive increase in landings at the same time. It's kind of correlative, and we've got a reference for it, but interestingly enough, about 4 years after that, there was also supposedly a collapse, which we do see a drop in the landings. There was also a collapse noted in the literature about 4 years later of nearshore fisheries due to overfishing. And there's also evidence to suggest that farms had been transitioning into marine fisheries during that time because of the failure of terrestrial systems. And so, of course, understanding how people adapt and then switch different food sources is a massive area of scant information in sustainability research. So there's a few really good papers here and there, but that's about it. And so I think that's a real gap in research that we need to address. So really, the paper is kind of a long one. There's no real punchy one solution. I mean, and that's food security in general, I think. But in summary, really, extreme weather and geopolitical instability were what we found as the major drivers as losses to agriculture. And these things are still happening today as well. So in 2016 was the first increase in global hunger since 2003, largely due to conflict in sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, and North Africa as well, and their interaction with harsh weather conditions. And that makes me think, well, can we stop the trends that we're seeing in extreme weather events? Probably not, based on the current political environment. But we also don't know how they're going to interact with conflict into the future. So that means that we've got this increasing trend in extreme events. We probably, from what a lot of people are saying, there's possible interaction there with conflict. And that means that, of course, that capacity for people to adapt is going to depend much more on things like social protection mechanisms. Things like weather index insurance is going to be a really fundamental part of how people cope and recover during these extreme events if they become increasingly frequent. Conflict early warning systems are going to be another thing, but these are still very marginal topics in food security discussions. These are very small things that people just add on and tack onto sort of discussions about it, and I really do think they're going to be a fundamental part of how we move hunger targets forward. Again, we found overfishing and subsequent stock collapses are the main historical drivers of fishery shocks, and again, we know that continues today, particularly in fish-dependent nations. So bold domestic policies are definitely needed, particularly in fisheries-dependent nations where we have a lot of people still getting revenue out of marine resources rather than directing them to food security where it's most needed. So finally, we do know that increasing aquaculture production is the way that we're going to supply these increases demand for animal protein into the future. And it's going to be much more attractive to a lot of people as well if they're experiencing a volatility on land. So to get away from that increased shock rates in agricultural systems, then shifting into aquacultural production is going to seem attractive. But we do need so disease control is going to be a fundamental limiting process in whether we can continue to speed up our animal protein production. I think so, just some closing thoughts from me just on a couple of things that have interested me and I hope to address to some extent by the end of my PhD. And this is the idea of that, well, okay, aquaculture is this massive growing sector, but we need to address how coupling it to agricultural systems. You may have heard that we're taking more fish meal out of feeds and putting more crops in, but there is still terrestrial limits that aquaculture will meet with rapid growth. And we need to understand how that affects the resilience of the system if agricultural systems are going to continue to be quite volatile under climate change. And another thing that I hope to be working on is how will these increased shocks affect the resilience of the global food system going forward. So if countries continue to get hammered, for example, by lots of different shocks over time, and if people tend to shut down their trade at times of shocks, if that's happening more and more frequently, will exports just change to a low state of trade connectivity? And just some preliminary work I've been doing on that, and that we're seeing a sort of this early warning signal of increased variance, which is sort of this sort of first sort of predictive characteristic you often see just before a major transition in time series data. So anyway, this is something I'm going to be working on, but that's all I really wanted to say for today. Thank you. It's that long. Go.
Funding by the research community, so thank you very much to them. So Christina, she did her PhD at JCU and then moved to Stanford to the Center for Ocean Solutions, and currently is a professor of environmental social science at Lancaster University in the UK. And she's recently received a really prestigious fellowship from the European Research Council to look at the contribution that small-scale fisheries can make to nutrition globally. And so she's going to be talking from the nutrition angle about this.
Thank you, Kirsty. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here at University of Tasmania. It's great to be here. As Kirsty said, I'd like to talk today about an ongoing collaborative project that we've had, which has really been a labour of love. And I started out on a shoestring, and since we've been successful with a few funding options. I like to call this hidden hunger, forgotten food, because as a social scientist, we like slightly esoteric titles. But hopefully I'll clarify what it is I'm trying to get across by that. So hidden hunger really refers to micronutrient deficiencies. So micronutrients are things that we need in very small quantities. And hidden hunger people became aware of it in the 80s, but it's very difficult to address because you can be fully fed, your stomach can be full, you can have sufficient protein or calorific intake, but you may still be lacking key nutrients that limit your long-term physical and mental development. So just a few statistics here. So micronutrient deficiencies account for over 1 million premature deaths annually, and it can negatively impact GDPs, particularly in countries in Africa, by up to 11%. But fish are really rich in these micronutrients. So things like zinc, iron, calcium, vitamin A, vitamin B12 are found in really high concentrations in a whole range of different fish species. However, ever since I started my career, and probably throughout my life, there's been this persistent crisis narrative that fisheries are in decline. And as somebody who works in communities in parts of the poorest parts of the world where people are really heavily dependent on fisheries for their livelihood and their food security needs, it can get quite depressing. But I'm constantly surrounded by people who are trying to actually understand trying to understand where maybe this may not be always the case. So a number of individuals and organizations, for example, World Fish Centre, the FAO, and the Too Big to Ignore initiative, are really highlighting the fact that many fisheries are what they're calling hidden. So there are many fisheries and there are many food sources that are underreported, under-recognized. And fish in particular is largely missing in global food security discourse. And many fishers, particularly in low-income countries where rates of malnutrition are particularly high, much of the fish that's landed in fisheries in low-income countries is used for local consumption. And the landings in these small-scale fisheries in low-income countries, by some estimates, equal or even surpass the industrial commercial landings. So the forgotten food component of the title is really trying to highlight the fact that there are food sources out there that we are not recognizing and not incorporating into our food security discussions. So a lot of my work really, and a lot of the work of the people that I've surrounded myself with, is really trying to find these potential islands of hope in this sea of failure that we seem to be documenting. So the question that in this talk I'm particularly, or in this paper that we've been working on, we're particularly interested in answering, is whether we can develop fisheries practices and policies that are more sensitive to nutritional needs within marine fisheries. So can we address hidden hunger from various marine fisheries landing sources? And to answer this, we've got 3 key questions. So firstly, what is it that we know about the nutritional composition of species? We know that over 2,000 species of fish are regularly landed and regularly traded. But we don't know an awful lot about how nutritious those different species are. If we can develop a better understanding of the nutritional composition of fishes, perhaps we can answer the second question to try and understand how fishery-derived nutrients are distributed geographically. And with this, perhaps we can begin to understand to what extent fisheries can help meet nutritional needs, particularly for the most vulnerable populations. So to start off with the first question, to try and understand what it is that we know about the nutritional composition of species, we went back to the literature, we conducted a large review, we gathered as much information as we could on the nutritional composition of different species of fish. We then went to the FAO. They've got this database called InFoods, where they began collecting and collating information on nutritional composition. And we also followed up with a number of key experts that we know who work in the fields of nutrition to ask them where their go-to sources are to try and understand nutritional composition data. We focused on the nutrients that are important to human health. And by that, we mean nutrients that we need to keep us healthy, but for which deficiencies are relatively prevalent. In total, we collected 14 different nutrients, or we found data on 14 different nutrients of interest that covered 424 species, so a decent amount of species, and over 4,000 different measures. And this pie chart here just shows you the relative amount of the relative amount of data available on the different nutrients that we were interested in. And just to give you an idea of the types of values, so I've got 4 nutrients up here, so zinc, calcium, iron, and vitamin A. In white are the average values, so the average nutritional composition for these 4 nutrients. But under that, I've got the ranges, and so for all of them, there's an absolutely massive range. So you could be eating a fish that has next to nothing, next to no iron in it, or you could be eating a fish that has a huge amount of iron. So from a human health perspective, it is important to understand which species are nutritionally rich and which are not. Looking at the geographic distribution of the data, probably unsurprisingly, this map here, the land is shaded based on HDI. So in dark grey, you've got countries that are of a high development, and in light brown, you've got countries that are low development. The coloured EEZs are based on the number of data points we're getting. So most of the information that we're collecting on nutritional quality of fish is from the high latitudes. It came from 45 different countries. So we had a relatively good geographic spread, but there were clear gaps because only 3% of our data came from low-income countries, which from a food security perspective is potentially where you are most interested. So we do know a fair bit about the nutritional composition of fish species. We know there's a large variation across it, but we also know there's a lot of data missing on species, and there's also a lot of data missing on geography. But we can do quite a lot with the data that we had. So we had a secondary sub-question, which was to try and understand what determines the nutritional composition. So can we use all of this data we got to try and develop a model to try and predict the nutritional composition of species that we don't have data for? So we drew on theory a range of different ideas and theories from broadly the ecological sciences. And you'd expect the nutritional composition of a fish to be affected by its diet. So we gathered a range of variables on diet of the fish, including feeding pathway, trophic level, and habitat. You'd also expect the composition to be influenced by the thermal regime that a fish lives in, as well as the energetic demands, so its growth, size, reproduction, mobility. So for all the species that we have data on, or for all the species that we had data on, we collected, that we had nutritional data on, we collected ecological and environmental traits data on this. And we developed a hierarchical Bayesian model to try and to see if we could predict the nutritional quality of other different species of fish. And so just running you quickly through this, what you've got up the side is the different ecological and environmental correlates that we expected to predict the nutritional quality of fish. You've got the different nutrients that we were interested in. Here I've just put up 5 of them: protein, zinc, iron, calcium, and omega-3. And standardized effect sizes are shown along the bottom. So, for example, for protein, species that had a pelagic feeding pathway and that had a higher trophic level tended to have higher concentrations of protein in their tissue. But the effect size for protein was pretty small. So actually, when it comes to protein, a fish really is a fish. Because although it has predictive ability, in practical terms, the variation is not likely to be that important. When it came to zinc, iron, and calcium, we found that species that tended to be smaller, but also species that were found in a tropical thermal regime tended to have higher concentrations of zinc, iron, and calcium nutrients. And finally, omega-3 was higher in species that had a pelagic feeding pathway again, but those that were also found in a polar or deep region. So species that live in a cold environment and feed off have a pelagic feeding pathway. So just summarizing that, there's relatively small variation in protein across species. Calcium, zinc, and iron is found in species that are small, that exist in tropical thermal regimes. And omega-3 is found in pelagic feeding species that exist in polar thermal regimes. So the next thing we wanted to do was use this model to try and project nutritional concentrations across the different species that we're regularly landing, to try and understand how these nutrients in fisheries are distributed. So we used the model, and we also turned to the Sea Around Us database in this instance to try and calculate nutrient yields and nutrients concentrations. So up on the left is just a map of the distribution of micronutrient deficiencies. So just to give you an idea of the geographies where micronutrient deficiencies are most prevalent. So these are places like in much of Africa, in southern Asia and India and places like that, where people are not getting enough of zinc, iron, calcium in their diet. This here on the map, this here on the right-hand side is a map of calcium distributions. What I put in the red here is an indication of the dietary requirements for children under 5 and an average adult male. Children under 5 are generally used within health and nutrition science because this is considered the age at which interventions can have the biggest impact. So they're the most vulnerable group, but they're also the group where we can make the greatest difference. So one thing to notice is actually the majority of fisheries, the concentrations of the landings or the catches for most fisheries globally is fairly rich in these key nutrients that we're interested in. And the area where deficiencies are particularly prevalent across the tropics are also relatively rich in these nutrients. Taking a look at zinc and iron, again, we've got key hotspots in areas of nutritional concern. So for zinc deficiencies, over 1 billion people are at risk of zinc deficiencies, and anemia affects almost 1/4 of the world's population. So anemia is iron deficiencies. So again, we're finding high concentrations of iron and zinc globally, but particularly in areas of geographic concern. Finally, I'll just show you omega-3 and selenium. Omega-3 is a nutrient, or omega-3 is important because it's thought to help reduce the likelihood of developing coronary heart disease, which is problems in developed countries, so high and low latitude countries, but also it's increasingly becoming a problem in countries across the Pacific. And again, we're finding high concentrations of both selenium and omega-3 across the world, but also in areas of geographies of key concern. So just summarizing the distribution of these nutrients. So we know, fisheries catches are potentially really valuable sources of key nutrients globally, pretty much all over where fisheries are caught. And there are these key nutritional hotspots that exist in geographies of particular concern. So the final thing I wanted to have a look at is coming back to trying to think of these idea of these islands of hope in a sea of failure. So what then is the potential for fisheries to meet nutritional needs, and particularly for the most vulnerable populations? So this would be in geographies of concern, but it would also be in those populations of under 5-year-olds. So I just want to put up a quick heuristic here to kind of explain our thinking on this. So if up this axis, what we've got is surplus nutritional need. So this is basically calculating the nutrients in the landed catch that is either above or below that needed to meet the dietary requirements of the coastal population of under 5s. So the coastal population covers a coastal band of 100 kilometers. And along this axis, you've got the prevalence of deficiency. So what is the nutritional gap? So the percentage of the population that are not getting the nutrients that they actually need, so the same population. So the first down here, if you've got a low prevalence of deficiency but low nutritional surplus, then fisheries are unlikely, or the potential for fisheries to meet nutritional needs are low, but that's not really a problem because there is no need. Again, where deficiency risks are low, but nutritional yields are high, there's no need to meet fisheries don't need to meet nutritional needs, but fisheries can be possibly used to try and help address nutritional needs elsewhere. Where deficiency risks are high, but nutritional surpluses don't exist, then fisheries are unlikely to help meet people's nutritional needs. But it's this box up here that we're most interested in finding out whether there are places that exist here where deficiency risks are high, but there are large nutritional surpluses from the landed catch. And it's this area that we think of as these islands of hope, because if nutrients are available, but deficiencies remain prevalent, there are potential for solutions to be interventions to be successful that don't involve external interventions. So this is just looking at calcium and zinc. So again, once again, up here is the surplus nutritional needs. The 0 point is where the nutrient yield in the fishery is equal to the dietary needs of the coastal population. Above the 0 line is where there's more nutrients in the fishery than the coastal population needs, and below the line is where there's less. And here you can see the deficiency risk. So the box where we're interested in, I've put the cutoff point at 20% because the WHO defines a deficiency of 20% as a high risk. So really, anywhere above 20%, we're probably interested in trying to improve people's diets. And there's a large number of countries that do exist in this top box. Just talk you through a couple of types of countries that are up here. So Sierra Leone, for example, has very high rates of deficiencies in most of the micronutrients, but also, yes, in calcium and zinc, as you can see here. And it also has these high nutrient yields. So in places like Sierra Leone, where actually fish is a large part of people's diets, we need to start asking questions around access and around trade. Why is it that the nutrients that are available in the waters aren't accessible to the coastal population? Other places, such as Peru, which have really, really high nutrient yields, but still have medium to high rates of deficiencies, similar questions. But we know from places like Peru that actually interventions that have tried to reroute some of the anchovies for human consumptions have really struggled. And part of that is because the cultural preference for consuming really strong, flavoursome species like fish, like anchovy, doesn't exist. But also the anchovy fishery is really profitable and is in supplying the fish meal and aquaculture industry. So it's not always going to be as simple as identifying the availability of nutrients and linking it to a population, because a number of barriers will exist to accessing it. The third type of country I'm just going to talk about is India, where you've got really high rates of deficiencies, but you don't have enough nutrients in the fishery. So the fishery is not going to be likely to help. Fisheries policies are not going to help address people's nutritional needs in India. And even if India did have high yields in the fisheries, it would be unlikely to help because of local cultural and religious preferences are not for fish consumption in this area. So I set out to try and find these islands of hope in that top quadrant, which could hopefully seed other places. And I think we've probably found islands of failure in this sea of hope, which I think is possibly a lot more positive, because potentially there's a lot more scope for actually having a positive impact. So just to summarize, the nutritional composition of fish, marine fish species, does vary significantly across species, but it can be predicted based on environmental and ecological characteristics that we have data already available for, including diet, energetic demand, and thermal regime. Our fish catches already are really rich in key nutrients that are really important to human health, even in geographies where deficiencies in those nutrients are of greatest concern. So I do believe that fisheries have the potential to meet nutritional needs in certain geographies, more so than they currently are doing so. But we do need to understand how things like trade policies, how diets, or how capacities may inhibit the ability of people to benefit. I'd just like to say, thank you very much, and acknowledge a few funders and for the travel grant here as well. Thank you.
Fisheries data, of which has formed the underlying basis for all the talks today, using this data. And the other thing to note is in 2017, he was recognised by Thomson Reuters as a highly cited researcher, so that's the top 1% of citations in ecology and environment.
And we have another one in the room too. Okay, I'll just finish off the series of talks. I've been asked to talk about trade, but I can't resist talking about a few other things first. I'm going to talk about the poor provenance of seafood, the diversity, how essential they are, the fact that they're finite. Some of my students already know this. The global flow, which is where we get into trade, and the pressures on the supply. This is the way most of us view seafoods. However, we don't actually know many of the seafoods that we're consuming with any degree of accuracy, particularly in the industrialized world. That would be equivalent, I would say, if you would go to Woolies or Coles, sometimes in terms of the identification of what it is that's on offer. And those people that pull a face when you talk about eating insects in the future should realize, obviously, that we're salivating over arthropods, and we're already into that group, so we already have very diverse seafood interests. But what perhaps most people overlook is that about a third of the harvested seafoods, and that's ignoring the fact that most people would put in quotations all the freshwater aquaculture as somehow being seafoods, is that about a third of that's taken, such as this Peruvian enchoveta fishery, the biggest one in the world in terms of the tonnage that's taken, is quite literally ground up and cooked and reduced to fish meal and the oils are extracted. And of course, those oils are amongst those that we'd like to take in capsules. And of course, there is that whole aspect of marine aquaculture that sometimes we overlook. This happens to be the prawn farms in Indonesia. And perhaps it brings on what the future might look like as we try and bump up the amount of seafood production around the earth in sort of a water world. But I'd like to talk about the essential aspect of seafoods too. I like this story. This was a group of relatively primitive, 40-something thousand years ago, living in caves in South Africa, and along came this boom in Indonesia, and Mount Toba erupted, and the weather changed radically. It would have put this small, clinging group of population of humans in really desperate needs, and they found that they hung on for a very long time, living on shellfish, gathering shellfish. So my argument here is that seafoods have sustained us through these big difficulties. When we were right on the knife edge and populations might have collapsed, seafoods came through for us. So seafoods might actually have to be there for us in the future in the same way. But now we get into the finite part. Most people here have got some background in ecology, and so they realize that seafood production as it stands now is somewhat finite because the food webs are being underpinned by the solar production and down at the primary productivity of the algal part. And along the coastlines, and most of you would be aware of this too, where the upwelling brings the nutrients where the sun can penetrate, you get these wonderful parts of the world which are the powerhouses which drive most of the production in the world's oceans. Well, obviously, we can't do much about the solar production, so it comes in at the bottom here, at this food pyramid, where there's a lot of biomass, the primary production. The sun's energy comes in there, and as these animals eat each other up through the different trophic levels, up to the very highest top carnivores, so that's the marine ecosystem. And of course, we're harvesting at various parts. We could be harvesting algae, or we could be harvesting the herbivores, or so on. So we're drawing from that. But of course, this is not a completely efficient system. So there's trophic losses at the side, and there's a number of us having a look at some of those, because this really comes down to how much seafood can be produced by the marine systems on Earth without making modifications to them. How much can we expect to get out of the world's oceans for the seafood that we require? That's a map what's some of the sort of stuff that we do. We try and map where the global fisheries are. We try and put it in space and work out what the gears are and stuff. So we've been involved in mapping fisheries. We've also been involved in looking at the trade as well. When you look at maps like that, though, you start looking at the primary productivity that's required to support the seafood harvest that we currently have. Well, back in the 50s, the proportion of the primary productivity that was coming into the system looked more like the top picture. And toward the bottom, and this is regardless of what efficiency you assume is in that pyramid, we look more like this. So in any way you cut it, we've actually taken more and more of that primary productivity in the world's oceans and basically pushed it our way. We've also probably, in many cases, simplified those systems so that more of it is coming our way, just like agriculture on land. What I've been involved with, and I'm not going through this, is trying to look at the provenance, the trade. And I've been trying to link the databases to do with mapped catches and aquaculture to eventually go through this whole process, complicated process of the trade thing, to work out who's consuming it, who's importing the seafood, and connect it up. And there is, unfortunately, complications as I become more and more aware of how this actually works, and people who are real trade experts come in and tap me on the shoulder and tell me I've overlooked something. You get to realize how convoluted this is and how much of this seafood is actually being shipped out of countries to be processed, to be only re-imported back in, to be shipped off to somewhere else. So doing this detective work, connecting it from one end to the other, is very difficult. It's much more difficult than trying to map the world's fisheries. In the first attempts, though, this is the kind of thing we've been able to find. We've been able to try and connect the fisheries in certain of the large marine ecosystems, like the Canary Current, shown in yellow on the left-hand panels, 70s and 90s, or the Humboldt Current here, to try and work out what the flow is of the seafood. And here, the countries that are importing the final seafoods are all just shown by the cities along the coast. We don't know, or rather, I'm not trying to find out where it goes once it gets into a country, where it ends up in Woolworths or whatever, but this is going to be challenging enough, and we've slowly improved our ability to do this. What we've also found is that, you have the source, you have the 50s and the 2000s. The redder color here is more of the primary productivity being used. So that's where it starts, and then when on the right-hand side, that's the consumption. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about consumption already, so I won't belabor this, but obviously the redder ones are the ones where there's more consumption. So it's basically a flow. And it goes something like this in terms of the fishing areas. You get the fishing areas on the left, those that in Africa, Asia, the high seas, very important, that part outside of the claims of countries, Europe, etc. And those are the regional fleets that are taking those catches. And this is in money. This is in $1 billion. Real dollars, I think was in year 2000 is the index year. And then it goes on to the country fleets in the various regions. You can get some idea, though, of the relative flows from the high seas into the different fleets and the relative flows in different parts of the world. We also have the exporting regions on the left-hand side here. Again, this is in dollars, in $1 billion. And then the importing regions, and then within that, which country is importing the catch. It gets a little more interesting here because you can see the flow from Asia. Obviously goes to Asia, a lot of it, but it also funnels into Africa and Europe, and some of the European catch goes to Asia, etc. So we're quite interested in how this actually works, and particularly down to the individual species and nutrition, but also in terms of, endangered species. There's a number of things that we can do if we can only pin this down, and it's very challenging indeed. Looking at the whole picture, this is what we've got in terms of the capture by decade, and this includes the freshwater captures. This is my best attempt back then to map all of the captures, wild captures, as well as aquaculture in the different decades, and then putting it together in the bottom. But you'll see, obviously, between the 50s and the 2010s, obviously an intensification toward the red of the scale in terms of production. This is a zoom of the capture one that's now covered. And you can see very intensive capture of the fisheries on the coastline. The idea I'm trying to make is it's finite and it's under a lot of pressure. In fact, I know this isn't a typical photo, but it's intriguing. This is one of the Chinese fleets. May well be a special time of the year, but I've never seen so many vessels going out of port at one time. But we do know, having worked with the UN on looking at fishing effort, we've been seeing that there's an actual increase, particularly in the Asian region, in terms of the combined power of all the fishing vessels. It's been that region that has the most increase. Yannick Rousseau is working on a better version of this, and we may not have the same conclusions when he's finished, but knowing what's happening regionally and what pressure is being brought on those finite resources is important. So this is something we did before. It's got 4 panels, and basically they say that the distance that the seafood is traveling is going up. The area and the intensity of use of the different parts of the ocean is going up. The global pressure in terms of the primary productivity required overall within the shallow areas as a percentage is going up. And this last panel I'm going to expand. This is the demand one. This is one that Chris Carter was on as well. Here we have a graph which is showing in the somewhat obscured blue dots going up the actual seafood consumption annually globally. And then the black diamonds are the projections forward from the United Nations. And we fitted a model which, of course, is related to the world population. And there's where it starts to get a bit difficult because there are all sorts of projections of the world's population, which is why it does this kind of thing at the top. The interesting thing, though, is that if you use seafood, then you have to put aquaculture. And if you do aquaculture, then you have to do whether it actually has any input, which is finite, from the wild stocks, as in fish meal and the feed, etc. And what it actually says is that if you have a high proportion of fish meal in that production, this is as high as the global production might be, which means that you can't, as the demand goes up with population, you can't really exceed that without doing something major to the marine ecosystems. But if you can reduce that, which is underway, then you can possibly get to this level where less than 10%, maybe 5% input in from the wild stocks into that aquaculture production happens. You might be able to reach a point where, depending on the population projection, you can produce enough seafood. And I guess that's one of those burning questions that we're all wanting to know, is there going to be enough food for us all? And what we've learned overall is a few things. That the seafoods are actually one of the most traded global commodities. They're actually, over time, when you consider aquaculture with the wild capture, they're going greater and greater distances before we get them on average. The areas of the ocean are obviously finite. Those that we can access, with new technology are in that way ever increasing, but obviously we are intensifying our use of them, and we're increasing the area that we're fishing into right down in the depths, which aren't particularly productive. And that if we want to move forward and produce enough seafood for the projected populations, we're probably going to have to use aquaculture. We're going to have to do whatever we can to maintain the productivity boosts in the wild systems, if possible. We're going to obviously have to keep our wild stocks intact. It would be really nice in that regard if we had better information on the problems of the seafood that we're being offered, because in that way the managers and everybody can do the right thing. We can make decisions about what it is we're consuming. Climate change, of course, plays into this, and particularly in the tropics, depending on whose paper you read. But we certainly have to minimize their impacts, because for the most part, they don't spell good news in terms of seafood production. It'd be good if we could develop some new fisheries, and usually where that comes in is either talking about the small pelagics, which are very emotive, particularly in Tasmania, although some of you probably saw that vessel unloading just about 50 meters from here. We can talk about that later. That was the small pelagic fishery. That was the same skipper as the super trawler driving that thing. Or it could be those lanternfish that you probably heard about, the gazillion tons of lanternfish that were glimpsed in sonar, and they might put all our problems aside. Maybe there's big problems exploiting those, but they are certainly difficult. But we're certainly going to have to increase sustainable aquaculture at the same time as trying to minimize the effect on marine ecosystems. Whether that means that we're still going to have a world that, coastlines that look like water world, like along Indonesia, or not, will be something maybe we'll just decide at the time, or maybe we'll make some plans ahead. And then we get into, I don't know if Phil's shot through already, but the ocean engineering part. Whether we actually decide that we're going to do something, maybe it's together with trying to lessen the effects of potential climate change. Maybe we're going to put CO2 down there. Maybe we're going to fertilize the oceans. But we're basically doing it like a terrestrial agriculture system. We're not going to leave the wild system the way it is and accept the limitations on the production. We're not going to share it with the biodiversity of the world's oceans. We're going to do like we did on land, and we're going to reduce it, we're going to modify it, and we're going to have it pointing our way, and that would probably mean great modifications of the shorelines. Those decisions, though, especially the ocean engineering, we'll have to talk about them because they are actually happening. Countries are starting to play around in that space, and I don't think they're going to be asking us whether they should go ahead or not. They're just going to go ahead and do it. So we better work out how that can work in our advantage and not destroy some of these marine resources. So that's all I have to say today. Thank you.
Anyone have any questions? Sana. Sorry. Yeah, definitely not all of them. There were, I can't remember the exact percentages, but probably I'll hazard around 30%, which is why we used, but we collected the environmental ecological data for all species in the landings, and so that was how we were able to then project the nutrient concentrations for all of the species. Absolutely, yeah. So now we're going out and collecting more data and ground truthing the model and filling in those gaps, definitely. Sorry, I missed the yeah, definitely. I mean, I think here in Australia, I think I know I was talking to people up in the Torres Strait, in JCU who work in the Torres Strait Islands, and there are really high rates of anemia, but it's patchy between islands. So it's not that all populations are deficient. So there's a lot to be done to try and understand, people's dietary habits, but obviously why they're not accessing seafood that's readily available to them, that culturally they would have. Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Which potentially are a lot harder to address, actually. Yeah.
So I was interested whether within a species there was quite a wide variability that was accounted for by temperature, and whether the nutrient composition is likely to change, for example.
So yeah, we do know that, say, as temperatures go up, omega-3 concentrations within species does decrease. So yeah, definitely things are likely to change with changing conditions. I think the thing about the nutrient composition at the moment is we're kind of just beginning to get an understanding of it, and there's so many factors that will drive variation, different nutrient inputs from land, different geographies, different ages, different sexes. So all of those questions are what now we want to start asking. But this is just kind of like, what can we do with what we currently know, and then where do we go from here?
I was just wondering if you had a theory as to why I think it was like calcium and zinc are higher in tropical species in comparison to those in temperate waters. Is that a diet-based thing, or?
Yeah, so, I mean, I guess with the zinc, we think it may be linked to different basically the geology of the continent in terrestrial areas being having higher zinc concentrations, and that being mobile and so being carried into the water. So yeah, I mean, we have some kind of suggested theories of why that is. With calcium, less so. I'm not really sure why that. I think maybe the link to less so with the calcium. Mm.
Oh, well, I guess I first have to start by saying that part of the Bridge Greens project going way back was to look at seafood, and particularly Australia's imports of seafood. And so Sean Tracy hasn't yet finished the publication, where we were looking very closely at what was coming into Australia. And one of the things about supply chains there was, and one of the things which I have to deal with, sometimes unsuccessfully, is that we know we get seafood from New Zealand, we get it from there, we get a lot from Thailand, and we know that Thailand didn't catch that fish, and they didn't grow that fish, they imported it from somebody else. So when you do this kind of detailed study like that, and you start paying the distributors to get the records together for you so you can look at it, you get to the point where you can find out what it was and where it came from in Thailand, and then you'd have to start all over again, and if they even knew where they got it from. And within Australia, say within states, I don't know, but yet most of you are aware, if you've been living here for a couple of years, that there was a big thing on the ABC about what's that catch or what's that fish. And I understood that, and they were shirt-fronting senators and everybody else about better information, identification of seafood. But I understand that sort of crash and burn because somebody said, and people know more about this than I do, was that Australia's rules about that were joined with New Zealand's rules about that, and we couldn't unilaterally change the rules about identification of seafood without having the New Zealand government agree to it as well, which is really odd, I think, but that may be the case. I would like to know what species it is. I'd like to know what stock it is. That's simply because if you really want to care about whether that's a stock, that's a fish you should avoid because you don't like the slavery practices, or you don't like the destruction of the bottom that might occur, or you just don't think it's being well managed. You can't make those decisions unless you know more about it. And everybody that's been in a restaurant and said, well, what is this fish? You get, oh, I'll go ask the chef. It's something fish. And you're really never sure whether that is actually what you're eating or not. And my point is, I think you know that in some cases, in working with trade people too, they'll get down to the subspecies level and this kind of rice versus that kind of rice, and then they'll want to lump together crustaceans and octopus and everything in the same thing. And we really have to come a little bit better than that in terms of knowing what it is and where it came from.
So, I mean, I guess for this initial thing, we were, I guess, so one of the challenges with stunting is, yes, it definitely is the result of micronutrient deficiencies, but other things contribute to it as well. So I guess here we've tried to focus on dietary gaps, so based on the food that's available and what people need, just because of, I mean, even with anemia, you know, there are other causes of anemia other than iron deficiency. So this is before we've actually gone out and done any field work, but most of the research field groundwork will be focused in the Western Indian Ocean, and there we will be collecting biometric assessments and various things that give us an indication of rates of stunting and link that back to people's diets, but also their blood levels and yeah, so that we will be doing all of that stuff, yeah. So I think aquaculture definitely is part of the solution. But then I would, I guess, say two things. So firstly, I guess this work is a word of caution to exactly what you said, making sure that aquaculture species maintain a high nutritional content, because what you feed a fish will influence its nutritional quality. So as good as shifting towards cereal-based feeds is for the environment, you're then not actually getting all the beneficial nutrients that were in fish. So it's a kind of trade-off there. The second challenge is that aquaculture is very geographically patchy. So it's a lot of aquaculture happening in Southeast Asia, in China particularly. It's very difficult to, aquaculture in Africa is largely failing. It's really difficult to kind of get the business investment, but also to kind of make it work, essentially, the business case for it. So I guess it is a part of the solution, but there are still a number of challenges in order to make sure the nutrients get to the people who need them.
So when it came to the flip of, are you suggesting the identifying where, like the frequency of drivers that we sort of identify here, and then sort of seeing whether that corresponds to a food shock, and if not, what the difference was that? Yeah, I think probably data is the limiting factor in it. I mean, a lot of the stuff that I've sort of philosophically been asking myself is, you know, when you've got increasing trends in shocks, is that because the data's better? And it's a similar thing of like, if you were to flip it around, I don't know whether the data would be sufficient in order to reverse engineer that sort of question. Yeah, I don't know how you would go about that. I don't know. Does anyone know of a data set that has that sort of information? I don't. I guess that's the. Yeah. Well, the other thing is that I was getting some fascinating trends that was, I could essentially have just said, well, if you take all the shocks to all food production, it had like an R-squared value when you try and model it against extreme events of any kind around the world. Something like 85% of the variance in the shocks were explained by this data of extreme events, when if you try and look at it at an individual shock level, a lot of them had nothing to do with extreme events. So I think the data will tell you a lot of stuff, and that's why I use that qualitative approach there, because the data was telling me stuff that sounded a little bit too good to be true, and it was. Yeah. So.
Kind of double question for Christine about potential of more pelagic fisheries. So the question is, do you know or is there any studies assessing if these small pelagic are richer in nutrients compared to because they have less protein and maybe higher concentration? You know? And the other question is there Is there any chances that exploiting these resources will increase the distance that seafood is?
Yes. I mean, the first question is, I don't know much about the nutritional quality of those small pelagic fish, except that they are at lower trophic levels. And so, inherently, that's usually where we're aiming to be, is harvesting lower in the food chain. And it is potentially a fishery that existed before and then somewhat collapsed, with an argument that with warmer waters it's moving deeper, and it was sort of marginal, and for a number of reasons it wasn't viable. So it becomes one of those fisheries that only the larger vessels, sort of industrial scale, the kind that people don't want around here, can really accommodate. And yes, obviously, if we were to eat those fish, but we would have to have it on our diet, we'd have to be having, you know, those little fish, but there, some of them are not that little, for breakfast, rather than whatever we are having. They were, the rationale that they had when they came in, that I heard, was that they were going to be frozen, or processed and frozen, and then they were going to be consumed in Africa or whatever. But as far as I knew, talking to people who actually were in touch with the people doing the fishing, it became a bit vague because they were being housed in the big warehouse as they got collectively bigger amounts of it ready to do something with it, and I don't know actually what happened to it. I don't know what happened to the stuff that was here about a month ago or two weeks ago. It went into semi-trailers and it went away. It wasn't frozen. I don't know who's going to eat it. But so, yeah, it would be nice if we could consume that, I think. However, the flip side here is, what kind of damage are we going to do? Is it affecting marine mammals? Is it affecting birds? If you're a recreational fisherman, are you impacting the food of the fish that I want to catch? All of those things basically made it unpalatable for people to have those fisheries operating. I don't even know why they were fishing here, but I guess they were fishing off the west coast of Tasmania this time, not in Bass Strait. Do you want to say something about the nutrients of those fish?
Yeah, I'll say something. So yes, you're right. They do tend to be richer in omega-3, but also in zinc, calcium, and iron, but lower in protein, which from a food security perspective doesn't really matter. But I think back to Reg's points. So in Peru, I think that it's difficult to. So the handling costs for fishing anchoveta, for fish meal reduction, are a lot lower, because you kind of just haul all the sardines onto the boats, and then, you know, to then fish that for human consumption, it would increase the cost of fishing, but also the fish meal industry is really quite profitable. So there's not the economic pull really to kind of redirect it towards human consumption. But people at World Fish, so there's a lady called Shakuntala, they've done some great work in piloting in Bangladesh, in freshwater, small species, but developing powders that are based off small fish, ground up into powders, and then redistribute them through feeding centres, sprinkled on babies' porridges, and that's testing it for cultural taste and various things like that, and that's had really big impacts. So there is potential, I think.
In terms of hunger, no, just because I think there's not a particularly reliable time series for hunger. So hunger has been decreasing up until about 2016, and then it had a bit of a blip